Good evening, Winterview. Back again with another brief dialogue with dear friend Annastacey. Once again, delivering the briefest of dialogues in his car on the way home. This brief dialogue is on the how to frame this. The experience, the lived experience of, I want to say enlightenment, it's a bit pretentious. The living realization. There we go. That's a much better topic. Okay, the living realization, and this is a very paradoxical subject, very surprising, I think. One of the parts of the living realization is that insight builds or shifts and grows and evolves about the nature of this in some ways. What is consciousness, what is awareness, what is the awakeness, what is life, what is Godhead, what is the unmanifest, what is the manifest, what is the void, what is beyond the void, what is presence, etc. These all become obvious in a way in the living realization, but they're not always known in a sense. They can shift around a bit and change and chop, but there is the one ever-presentness, you could say, is the presence itself, not the presence itself. Being or presence is an ever-present, funnily enough, reality or lived reality in the living realization. One of the understandings that comes along with it, along the way, you could say, perhaps sooner or later, is a sort of seeing of how the world or the universe is created moment by moment. It's a fascinating sort of process in a way, and the destruction in that moment, at the same time, a sort of weird creation, destruction. We don't have a word for it. The thoughts, for example, sort of fold. I see it as a folding in a sort of matrix, you might say, of thought, and then out. That goes along with the rest of the totality, all happening together, all rising together, seemingly in layers, as if thought is sort of overlaid against some other part of reality, but it's not quite the case. It all folds in, or folds out even, in and of itself. The more interesting thing for me is the character, the person in the living realization. It's a very funny thing. It's very hard to believe, I guess. The Enlightenment mythology would suggest benefit for the person. I mean, it just smacks of benefit. To be enlightened seems like the ultimate character trait that one could achieve. But the enlightenment is not for the person. The person is not enlightened. The person is, if they are anything, and I'm not saying they are, but if they are anything, they are another experience within the totality, within the manifestation. And such that, this is where it gets very surprising, such that all the foilables and limitations, character flaws, the muck, can stay around. Very surprising. There can be vulnerability in the living realization for the character, for the imagined character, we'll call them, They can be socially anxious, socially awkward. They can be not good in giving public speeches, or maybe not good at work in the job that they're given, the task that they're given. Maybe they're not great at it. They could be a bit lazy, a bit absent-minded. That certainly happens here. The experience of this character was it's very interesting. In the living realization for Winterview continued more or less as Winterview always has, with a couple of, you might say, little exceptions, a few finesses here and there that made things a bit easier in terms of relaxation and not stressing as much about the future. But the core character deficits that were always there, that were always struggled with and rejected in a way, they're still there, absolutely still there. The limitations are absolutely still apparent, but there's no I think what's funnier, or going back to this surprisingness, is that it doesn't matter anymore. No one cares, which is really peculiar. No one cares that this character, as in there's no one in this character to care about the character. It just seems to unfold automatically. I'm trying very carefully to avoid the personal pronoun in this particular dialogue, to try and give a sense of the lack of agency and the sort of automaton sense, in a way. It absolutely just unfolds automatically without any sense of volition or directing this at all. The character can still have pain, and there can still be suffering for the character, but not to the degree, the historical degree. I'm not sure. I'll have to do a brief dialogue on that when I think more about the mechanics, perhaps, of that. But the suffering is certainly muted, but the pain can be certainly the same, perhaps even worse in some circumstances. This in a way suggests at the freedom represented by the manifest in its essence, in its essential form. You see, the character unfolds in a sort of narrative sense, with the mind reporting the narrative. And within the narrative that unfolds, it might appear that this character's on a journey to some kind of improvement, that I'll get better in the future if I can just overcome the following limitations, and so on and so forth. Those grand ideas for the character are typical of the ideas that tend to fall away in the living realization. The mind, in essence, when reality is reflected back off the substrate of being itself, the mind has no purchase in that situation, and falls into what I call a more natural functioning, a more humbled, realistic functioning, quieter, not necessarily totally silent, but a lot quieter and a lot more functional. That's a nice way of putting it. The mind becomes a lot more functional. The character, it's realized instantly, was never personal, was never something to do with me or I or anything, and becomes a little more nebulous, or that's an understatement. It becomes quite nebulous. It comes into the out of the unmanifest. You get this manifest universe within which appears the character, and within which it makes sense in the appearance. The intelligence that is doing that, if there is such a thing, is stunning. And that means that the mundane becomes that which was formerly seen as mundane suddenly becomes fascinating and incredible. The act of driving, which for those of you listening who drive, can get boring. It's sort of something, yeah, I know what I'm doing. And you tune out in the driving, because it's a known quantity. The mind knows driving now. But in the living realization, and this is not true of all driving, but sometimes if attention gets turned to the act of driving, it's suddenly marvelous. How does it happen? It's incredible. It's this concert of the road appearing in front of the car, with the car appearing in front of the awareness and the body appearing in the car. It all unfolds, magnificently, like a seamless, perfectly, like a jigsaw puzzle flying together out of the ethers, you might say. That's perhaps being a little poetic, a little too much license, artistic license there on that description, but something like that. So getting back to this character, this is a very surprising element of the living realization, that this character can still unfold with all its faults and foibles. It seems like a disappointment. Like, no, I really was hoping that liberation would bring something to me for this person. I really hoped secretly, perhaps, deep down, that if I could get liberated, then I could perhaps manifest some life that I really dreamed about, like a fantasy life in a way. Maybe I could be a famous liberation speaker who does talks and whatnot. Maybe I could sit blissfully in a cave and just smile at the suchness of life, that kind of thing. And there can be, and this is taking reports, that the living realization, or the moment, you could say, of the living realization, the moment of realization, can be brutally painful. You might say it's the image, the self-concept, which the mind was deeply attached to, very deeply attached to, in terms of importance, status, security, stability. It's a known quantity, etc. When that's shattered, it's all the attachments to the security are blown apart, totally blown apart, and that can feel absolutely terrifying. A weak at the knees, stomach turning experience that you might not wish on your worst enemy. It can be felt and experienced and perceived as death and dying. The character of it's not actually death. What is actually dying, or what is felt as if it's dying, is the relinquishing of the mental conceptual attachments to the valued structures of person and self that were somehow, as I said earlier, known, and in that way there was security. There's a sweetness that emerges in the living realization about not only this sort of perceived character, this imagined character, but that of others too. That they're all coming out of the unmanifest by some unseen intelligence, you could say. Being very careful to skirt around the issue of God. It's a bit tricky. That sweetness is a sort of a recognition of the sincerity of each person trying to play their role in life and feeling like they're getting ahead or failing or whatever. It's incredibly endearing, and it brings about a wonderful intimacy with people in your daily relationships. Not all the time, some people are still pains in the bum, but there's the openness remains in the living realization. In pretty much every encounter there's a wonder of what's going to happen here in this encounter. What's going on here? Who's this wonderful character that I'm about to meet? What's their little story, and all that fun stuff. The mind is, I guess, blinded to that to a degree. In we'll call it the unenlightened or pre-awakening, which is a funny term and I'm not a big fan, but let's just roll with it. The mind thinks it knows the world. It thinks it knows what's happening. There's science, and it thinks it understands stuff, and and even science, while I mention it, it's a funny one, because even the unfolding of science unfolds in the manifestation. Out of nothingness comes science, or what we call science, and with that comes characters called scientists who seem to take science seriously. This is science, and call it reality, and call it discovering reality, and it's all very serious in that sort of fun, and it's a very funny experience in the living realization to see the seriousness of science and how it's taken, because of course the scientists in that role, when they're, you might say, blinded to that greater reality, which is not quite an elegant way of putting it, but let's just again roll with that. They can't even imagine something outside of the mental constructs, not just of science, but of course of themselves. So this brief dialogue was a nod to to that living realization, which I haven't addressed before really in other dialogues. It's probably the hardest topic of them all to give a brief dialogue on, and the reason, I suspect, is you can tell by my language it becomes very cautious in the living realization dialogue, because everything that is said seems or could be very easily taken by mind as a directive, or a process directive. You have to, or it could be taken as if you don't see it this way, you're wrong, you're not on your way, or all those types of thoughts. The mind, I noticed, when it reads accounts of liberation / enlightenment, tends to look at the account and go, wow, is that what my experience is? And if it isn't, then I'm wrong, or I'm not, and this isn't correct in some way. That's a big risk in talking about living realization, because each body, mind / brain / entity will only has the cognitive apparatus to express it in a particular way. It's, if someone is not very sophisticated in their cognitive ability, language, concepts, etc., they'll give a very generic, they might give a very generic overview of this. Not that it's a lesser overview, it'll just sound different to, say, someone who's a poet, someone who's a scientist, someone who's very spiritual. That's another funny point, that a person who is deeply steeped in spiritual tradition, who wakes up to this realization, will tend to steep it still in their sort of spiritual stuff, and so each account that's read will flavor it with a certain spice, and it's easy to think, because someone is using spiritual type language and talking about the stillness, the peace, the inner peace within, and the all that, and meditation and silence, and feel the silence and go deep with it, all that crap. It's very easy to get sucked into that as, okay, that's what it's got to be. But you could be a real live wire. You could be a bit off the wall, a bit kind of crazy and have this realization, and the way it's communicated could take on that flavour, a bit sort of erratic and wild, and no spiritual language, and maybe street language, a lot of swearing, and it's fucking stillness, man. That kind of, I don't know what this is. I don't know why I'm trying to suddenly sound like a New York gangster, but there you go. Maybe because it's my past life, channeling that through right now. Absolutely. Anyway, that's it for this brief dialogue. And thank you for listening. As usual, your comments are welcome.